it is that time of year again. We are talking all things statistics when it comes to my reading year. So let me scooch on over here. Let's talk about my stats for the year. So overall, I read 210 books this year, which is kind of on par with what I read last year. I think last year I read 208. So we're very close year to year here. At the end of this video, I will also be doing a year by year comparison to talk about a couple of stats across my years on BookTube, so stay tuned for that. My average star rating was a 3.89, which is pretty high, to be honest. And the reason it's so high, first of all, is that I DNF books all the time. If you haven't seen my DNF videos, I will link those above. And so when I know a book isn't going well, I just put it down, which is partially why my rating is so high. And also because I reread a lot. I only reread like 20 or 25 books this year, but that still bumps my rating up because I'm only reading like 5-star rereads. One of the stats I like to track is where I got the books from, and showing that right now. This year, I used the library slightly less than I have in the past. I think because I was like binge reading series, so I would get the first book in the series from the library, read it, and then have to buy books 2, 3, and 4, looking at you, John Gwynn, from, you know, Libro FM or whatever to read. The library also does certain things, like they only have the first book on audio, and then the other books in the series, they only have ebooks. And for me personally, I have a hard time reading ebooks. So I tended to buy a few more books this year. 62.5% of the books I read were from the library. Normally, I read about 70% of the books from the library, so we're not too far off, but something to keep in mind is I do use the library a lot, but this year was slightly less than previous years. Every year, I read more and more percentage-wise adult books than I do middle grade and young adult, and that is shown here. What was it, 86.5% or 179 books were adult titles, and the other 50 were middle grade or young adult. This year, I not only tracked the main genre of the books, but I also was curious about subgenres. So first we'll talk about the main genre. Of course, my main genre is fantasy. Fantasy, romance, then science fiction. Last year, horror was in my top 3, and this year I didn't read quite as many horror books, but fantasy is obviously my favorite genre and one of my top genres, and romance is also a top genre. And romance is up there in terms of my favorites. I want to read more sci-fi in general, and I've wanted to read more sci-fi in general for a long time, and I have been reading a good amount of sci-fi. It's just getting them from the library is actually a problem. My library stocks more fantasy than they do science fiction. Now look, I know this is an overwhelming graph, but look at the subgenres graph. I kind of like when there's a lot of colors going on, but that's just me. The interesting thing is I think my top subgenre is contemporary romance. So, you know, even though romance is my second highest genre, I read a lot of one type of romance, which is why it's the highest percentage on this subgenre category. Interestingly enough, military fantasy is high up there, and I don't particularly enjoy military fantasy. I think I just found a lot this year, which is interesting. Another category that's pretty high is classic fantasy. I was trying to read some older backlist titles, and what I mean by classic fantasy is like kind of classic European medieval, like classic tropes in fantasy. That's kind of what I mean. I don't necessarily mean like Lord of the Rings classic fantasy. I mean like older titles or books that kind of feel like a traditional classic white European, I'll say, fantasy. And that's a pretty high percentage, because I like those, okay? But another one that's pretty high up there is fantasy romance. And my fantasy romance is like typically higher on the fantasy elements than the romance elements. I don't, for example, like super smutty fantasy romance, but every once in a while I've been kind of dabbling in the genre more and kind of enjoying it. Anyway, I won't go through every pie slice on this graph. I just think it was an interesting experiment to see not only the main genre, but the subgenre. There were certain things I didn't really know how to categorize, especially in the horror category. I still feel kind of like a newbie to the genre and was a little bit more unfamiliar with like subgenres of horror. So that one was a little bit tough for me, but in general, like fantasy, I know super well. Romance, I know as a genre super well. So that was a little bit easier for me to track. So it was just kind of an interesting experiment to see if I got any value out of this. And I think it's just cool to look at, first of all. And second of all, it's really interesting, especially the contemporary romance slice. I didn't realize I read so many contemporary romances. Here is another view of the subgenres, so you can see them kind of laid out in a bar graph instead of a pie chart, just to visualize things maybe a little bit differently. My favorite subgenre that I wrote is very silly, but the final one on there is aliens are smarter than humans. That is I guess it's more of a trope than a genre, but I love it when there's a book where the aliens are smarter than the humans. Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky has that trope in it, and I absolutely love it. And The Remnant Population is another one that has that genre or trope in it. And I want more books where aliens are the top dog and humans are lower on the food chain. I think we need to be humbled sometimes. But that's what this graph looks like in a slightly different format. I did a better job of tracking like nationality of the author this year. A lot of the books that I read this year were from US based authors. This is not necessarily a problem. Obviously, I am from the United States. A lot of the books that I have access to are from here. Just something to keep in mind. A lot of UK authors too. You know, UK, Canada. I'm an English speaker too, so and I have found there are certain types of translated fiction that also just don't work for me. I find like Japanese translations to be incredibly dry, but I also like to read manga, so there's that. Almost 30% of the books I read were by BIPOC authors, which is a number I have always wanted to be closer to 50% BIPOC authors. But every year it's about 30%. So something I keep wanting to improve, and I don't exactly know how to, because those books are harder to come by. Not because they're not there, but because my library doesn't buy as many copies of BIPOC books. And so the wait times for those books are longer. So there's something to be said for that, and I don't want to get into too much of a discussion in this video, but that is partially the reason why that number is a little bit lower than I'd like it to be. I could also, you know, just try to read more. I do tend to binge read series though, and that's the other part. Like, for example, John Gwynne is a white man, and I just really found his work compelling, and so I binge read 5 of his books this year, and so that also like pads the numbers a little bit. So if I find a series or an author that I'm kind of obsessed with, I'll read all of their work. And I'm trying to do that with like Kennedy Ryan. I did that with Talia Hibbert. But you know, I need to click with an author, and sometimes it's not always a Black or brown author. It's not always a BIPOC author. So I'm doing my best here. 144 or 69.2%, almost 70% of the books I read are on audio. I did read 40 ebooks, or almost 20%, which is pretty good. And then not very many physical books, which is on par for me because I'm physically disabled. So audiobooks and ebooks are just easier on my little hands. This is always just an interesting stat. I don't feel any particular way about it, but it's very consistent. Every year I read about 70% audiobooks, which is hilarious. I think that's so funny how year to year I'm pretty consistent, even though it's not something I like necessarily pay attention to. It just happens. And then the last graph I have to talk about is reread or new. 182 titles, or 87.5% of the books I read were new to me, and 12.5%, or 26 titles, were rereads, which I feel like in previous years I reread a lot more than this past year, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a good thing. It's just interesting to note. I definitely tried a lot of new books this year. Maybe I didn't need my comfort reads as much as I thought. Lastly, we're going to be doing a little bit of a side-by-side comparison in terms of a few stats. So you can see from 2020 to 2023, the number of books read, pages read, average rating, average page count per book, most read genres, new versus reread statistic, and library statistic. So here are all of those stats. I'm not going to talk about every single one. Last year I read 211 books, and this year I read 210. Much closer than I thought. It's interesting to me that my average star rating is going down. Am I picky? Probably. I definitely noticed in fantasy and contemporary specifically, I'm a little bit more harsh in my ratings. I think it's because those are like my favorite genres, and I tend to know what I like and know what doesn't work for me, and so maybe that's a reason. I still do DNF books a lot though, so that's interesting. Average page count is not something I super care about, but it is interesting to note that I read books that are usually about 350 pages. Some shorter, some way longer than that too, so there's that. And then this year, favorite or most read genre, fantasy, romance, and science fiction, is on par with my previous years. Except for horror. Horror, like I said, was a genre I didn't dive too much into this year. But the horror I did read, I found some new horror favorites. So that's really nice. My reread versus new percentage is 10% higher than it was last year, which is very interesting. I was definitely trying a lot of new books and new authors this year. That was something I was kind of focusing on. Also, like, again, I would like binge read a whole series this year. I try to focus on that. And then the library percentage is a little bit lower than last year, but overall is a pretty high percentage. So saving lots of money and supporting my local library is something that's very important to me. And it's not something that I'm like upset about that it's a little bit lower, but it's good to know and good to keep in the forefront of my mind to just keep using the library. It's great. It's free. And while it isn't a perfect system and there are some issues, like I was mentioning with like BIPOC titles, it still is a great resource for a lot of folks. So I'm happy to use it and promote it whenever I can. Anyway, those were the statistics for my 2023 reading. What do you think? Did I do okay? I think the subgenre graph was probably my favorite stat to track this year, just because I really had to like think about it and think about what type of fantasy I was reading, what type of romance I was reading. So just a new thing to think about and track. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in another video of mine very soon.